Wonderful. Hello, hello, hello. Hello. Yeah, that's me. Oh, God. How close should we be? Hello. Oh, you can hear me. Wonderful. I'll get back.
It's okay as long as we're a consistent distance because they can change the levels.
That's true, that's true.
You can't change the levels.
Amazing.
Great.
That's fine. We'll ask them.
Yeah.
If you can hear me, shout and I'll speak on it.
I can't hear you, really.
I'm going to mumble.
Okay. You should have got a monitor. Oh, well.
That's fine, that's fine.
Hello, everybody. Hello. Welcome to this Radical Book Fair event on today's far right. Thank you very much for joining us. The threat of the far right is ever present in the realms of politics, culture, and beyond. Being radicals and progressive activists involves resisting the encroachment of reactionary and fascist movements. But the age of the internet has transformed the face of the far right. 20th century images of black shirts on the National Front have given way to alt-right YouTubers, incel basement dwellers, and black-pilled spree killers. In short, the post-internet far right has splintered into a relatively diverse groups and interests that nonetheless still seem to cohere around certain ideological touchstones. Here to tell us more, and to tell us how we can be effective anti-fascists in the age of the metaverse, are Alex Roberts, he, him, and Sam Moore, he, him. I am Jim, also he, him. I'm the manager of Lighthouse. Sam and Alex host the podcast 12 Rules for What, a podcast about the far right, and are the authors of this book, Post-Internet Far Right, from Dog Section Press. They also have another book coming in the new year about the rise of eco-fascism. Could please join me in welcoming our guests for this event. Just as a note, we do strive to avoid all male panels at the Radical Book Fair, but I am a late replacement for another chair, so I can only apologise. The structure for this event will essentially be much the same as the others. I'm going to ask some questions to Sam and Alex, and they will have a conversation, and then there'll be time for audience questions at the end, so get your thinking caps on now. I'd just like to begin by asking both of you, essentially, to define what you mean by the far right, both in this book and on the podcast. What do we talk about when we talk about the far right in this day and age?
Hello, so thanks for having us. Generally when we get asked definitional questions, the thing to do is to take like a step back and ask the definitional question before that. So I'm going to try and answer that question as well. And that question is like, what is politics? Just a massive and like, it can be an insanely broad question that I'm not going to be able to give even a remotely good definition to, but I'm going to try. Politics is about the contesting and like organization of social roles in society or social structure. And there are certain kinds of structure within politics, within existing societies. And it's the purpose of like different groups in politics, the far right, the far left, the center, the left, the right, blah, blah. It's the purpose of those organizations, those like parts of politics, to try and restructure that political, collection of roles, structures, and so on. Right? So that's a very broad general definition. So the question is really, what is the far right's interests, and what are the far right's tactics within the process of contesting social roles, process of contesting social structure? And I think that the far right, as you can tell, it's like a directional thing. It's like to the right of something. And what it's to the right of is the hegemonic form of politics now and for the last 100 years or so, which is liberalism, right? The far right, now I'm going to get to the definition. The far right is the collection of techniques and tactics and ideas for reproducing the existing order of society using techniques that are not admissible, at least publicly, to the liberal state. Right? So it's collections of things that are involve contravening human rights. For example, in the calls from big radical far-right street movements, the EDL, the Scottish Defence League as well, of course, the DFLA, and these kind of massive 100,000 person, perhaps, far-right street movements, which in some ways just argue for the existing order of society to be done, but to be done more intensely. Muslims to be persecuted more strongly by the police, right? That's what they want. So they're not arguing for anything radically different, but they want just this persecution to intensify. And this is not publicly admissible to the liberal state, but it is privately admissible to the liberal state. And so it's about the question of the far right being integrated into the existing order as the kind of the secret bit that perpetuates forms of domination in society. That's a really long answer, I'm sorry about that.
The other thing about this, when we get into definitions, is the word fascist, people like to, there's always arguments about like who is a fascist and who isn't a fascist. And I think oftentimes these are not really useful questions. How do you define something? Is it, if it's bad, you should be organizing against it in society. And so what we've said from the very start of our podcast is, and I think I said it in the very first episode, was, you know, people often think about the far right as like one massive glom of fash. And it's like it's one big ball and everything, it's all the same and it's all bad, basically. And it is all bad, but within what we call the far right, there's all these contradictions, all these tensions. They're not like in lockstep with each other. And so you'll see, if you could start reading this material or you start observing their live streams or whatever, you'll see them, you know, bickering, arguing with each other all the time. There'll be some far right groups who'll denounce like people like the Christchurch shooter, for example. And then there'll be on the other side, there'll be these extreme people who basically call, you know, anything to the right of them, you know, the EDL or the DFLA or Britain First. They'll be like, they're just not even far right, they're like liberals or whatever. And so we need to understand the far right today. We need to understand it not as like some kind of one-party thing, or just the Nazis or Italian fascists or even the NF, BNP, but as like a collection of different tendencies and different groups. And in that way, we can like get within them and break them apart, both within those tendencies and between them as well.
Thanks for that. Yeah, in the book, you distinguish between sort of four, I guess, key streams of the far right today, which are, you know, conservatism, reactionary thinking, fascism, and sort of black-pilled neo-Nazism. Could you say a little bit more about the distinctions there and also the potential for a kind of bleeding between them?
So the way we do that in the book, distinguishing between conservatism, reaction, fascism, the black-pilled, is by looking at the way in which they use means and ends. So like, what are they trying to achieve and what are they willing to do to achieve it? So the question is like, what tactics are available? And for conservatives and for reactionaries, the tactics that are available are basically the same tactics that are available in the rest of politics. Running elections, campaigning, maybe like leaking things to the press and getting the press to run like attack stories on your political opponents, going on Question Time, right? Like these are the kind of the tactics that are admissible to these kind of parts. With people to the further right of that and kind of in the reactionaries as well, there are tactics that, for example, are much more kind of underhand that they're willing to use. With fascists, everything is on the table. Everything is on the table. And with the black-pilled, something odd happens. It's not just that everything is on the table, because it absolutely is, but that everything is, that they intensify the process of political conflict so much that they lose sight of what the purpose of the political conflict is. They're just interested in sustaining the political conflict. And hence you get groups on the really far neo-Nazi edge, which are called black-pilled groups, as in, you're probably familiar with the red pill, blue pill logic from the Matrix, right? Red pill is like seeing through the world, and the blue pill is norminess. The black pill is when you have seen through the world so much that you know there's no way of changing it. The world just is how it is, it sucks, and all you can do is just revolt in the most like aggressive way you possibly can. That's it, that's all there is. And so because there is no hope of achieving their ends, their political ends, they get fixated on the means of politics, terrorism, violence, intragroup murders, and so on. And hence why you get these tiny little groups that seem very spectacular from the outside, but are really, really very small, I assure you, who basically end up just like destroying themselves because they become fixated on politics to such an extent they lose sight of what it's about, what it's for. And so, yeah, I would say you can define it in relation to kind of means and ends.
Do you know Alex?
He said it, it's good.
So the book particularly, the book concerns the internet, and the far right and the age of the internet. And indeed, when we talk about today's far right, it's impossible to do that without talking about the internet and the impact that it's had. What are the kind of main effects that the advent of mass internet usage has had on the far right, on the shape of the far right, particularly with regard to recruitment and new organizational forms that are being used?
It's like super strange to be talking about this kind of, because a lot of these changes, all the internet's been around for a fair amount of time now. We've only really seen these changes like within the 2010s, really, and that's when our book we go back a bit in history, but that's when our book kind of really gets going. And even then, it's even with the kind of advent of Trump and his only election, where we like really pick up the story. And part of that is because the book's called Post-Internet Far Right, and what we mean by post-internet is not that we're all past the internet, and no one's past the internet, we're all in it. But the idea of post-internet is that it's so kind of subsumed into our everyday lives that it's no longer like a notable thing anymore. Like, instead of like telling someone an address, you'll drop a pin on Google Maps and they'll follow the pin to the thing, and it's all part of our lives now. And so obviously that has a massive impact on all of us who regularly use the internet, and it also has a massive impact on politics. And we can see various kind of internet-based political movements, or ones that are kind of in real life, but also real life, who are in the physical world, but also online. I think maybe particularly the kind of project that movement that arose around Corbyn in 2017 and before. But it also affects the far right too. And so what we've seen is that, this has lots of different effects, but a few of the most notable ones is a kind of changing from far right political leaders who like are on top of organizations and who are answerable to the membership, or the membership answers to them. And then kind of a coming out of kind of far right influencers who have all the trappings of influencers. They have their live streams, they make YouTube videos, they have massive followings on social media. They're just really far right, and they're fascist, and they say fascist stuff on their influencer channels. And obviously the kind of prime example of this kind of transition, and you can actually see it in his career, is Tommy Robinson. He goes from like the leader of the EDL, which is like a diffuse movement, but it's still very structured. It's got regional leaders, it has branches. It's not as organized as a party like the BNP, but it's still a thing. And he moves, when he leaves the EDL, and very briefly has his reputation laundered by the Quilliam Foundation, who are stupid people. He kind of transitions into an influencer model, in which instead of leading an organization, he's turning out his audience. And that has the biggest effect in the Free Tommy movement, where he got like the biggest far-right demonstration since the BUF, since Mosley's BUF. 15,000 people on the streets of London coming out for Free Tommy demonstration. But the consequence of that also is that there's very little bonds between these people. They're just an audience member. They have a relationship to Tommy, but they don't have a relationship between themselves. And so the audience can, as quickly as the audience can come onto the street, it can disappear as well. And that's, there's opportunities here, but it's also kind of scary how quickly things can develop.
You mentioned briefly there the kind of coalescence of the right, or the far right as an online phenomenon around, for example, Trump's presidential candidacy being announced, and certainly it seems that the public awareness of the far right as an online phenomenon was generated around perhaps, Trump's candidacy, but also before that maybe Gamergate to a lesser extent. And I think, is that too simplistic a reading, or is that pretty much what happened in terms of,
So the first chapter in the book is a chapter on feelings, and emotions on the far right, which is obviously a very strange place to begin. And I think the reason why we wanted to begin there is because that's the position when we think about how people are being made and remade by capitalism. It's useful to understand why it is that you would have this kind of fraction of people who are being kind of chopped off from the rest of society, who are trying to isolate themselves from the rest of society, who were aggressively against it in a way that reinforces its most kind of fundamental ideas. So the point about putting the feelings chapter first in relation to this question is that it's not just about results in the outside world, it's not just about political events, although those are incredibly important. Trump's election and the far right stuff was like a properly inspirational moment for the far right, and it's one that will linger for a very long time, in the same way that, for example, like May '68 as a kind of a received event in the leftist canon still gets talked about now. I think we saw something of that magnitude with the election of Trump. So it's not that the events don't matter, but it's also that there is a structure of feeling, a way of feeling yourself in the world, a way of understanding yourself in the world that has been developing, I think, throughout the age of the internet. And the question is like, why? And in order to answer that question, then we have to go a bit further back, right? Which is to say that after the Second World War, let's kind of start there are mass associational societies, right? There's groups of some people in society who are very densely and complexly knitted together. Unions are a major part of like social life. People are involved in society in lots and lots of different ways, and in a way it's kind of like complex and meshed together, right? It's not like people can be atomized very easily. And then in the neoliberal transformation, you get this shredding of those bonds. You know, what happens in neoliberalism, like all of these structures that were built to put people together are just like torn apart, right? They're just kind of shredded, people are atomized. And then what happens with the internet is that suddenly all those people who have been atomized and split up and put into little kind of camps of one, right? They're all in this kind of like atomized way. They are all suddenly reconnected in ways that are premature, kind of inadequate, solely based on communicative exchange rather than collective life, you know, and so on. So there's like a fracturing of society, atomization, and like a sudden resurgence of people. And it's in this sudden resurgence, people suddenly feeling themselves to have power, that we get the return of this kind of new fascist subject. And Gamergate is just like a place where that kind of flares up. And then Trump's election is a place where that flares up again. But it's really the longer story, and the story that is more explanatory, I think, is about the transformation in the way in which people are made under capitalism and the way in which social structures of political contestation have changed over the last 150 years, since the rise of mass societies.
I don't know, do I have something to say? I think what we really haven't contended with on the left is the kind of the classic image of the 4chan NEET, or the kind of the young man alone in his basement or his bedroom, drinking Mountain Dew, and, you know, calling everybody normies and developing very incredibly like awful views and ways of seeing the world and ways of relating to people, which you can, if you go and scroll some forum on 4chan, you'll see a lot of like really horrendous like misogyny and homophobia and all this kind of stuff. And we kind of condemn it, we rightly condemn it. We also don't ever really come to understand how these people became how they were, or at least I haven't really seen much. There is actually, that's unfair. There is some thinking about this, but as like a broader movement, we need to understand this as well, I think.
Thank you. Well, something that's kind of lightly touched on there, and is what my next question's about, which is that I mean, we were talking about this before the event, but I do feel that the link between fascism and feelings, feeling is something that's underexplored, certainly in an analytical sense. But a core part of it in the book is the way that fascism is tied to particular conceptions of masculinity. And that's something that goes back to, you know, the early 20th century. So how has that sort of persisted and developed over time?
I mean, if you look at something like the incel movement, which is, or the, not movement, because it's not really going anywhere, but it's the incel phenomena, is that, you know, there's many ways of conceiving of it, but for me, one of the most kind of intriguing ways of thinking about it is as a form of collective self-harm. Like, a lot of these people are on these forums posting, obsessing over various parts of their body, often to a very ridiculous level. You know, it's often very easy there's an impulse to say to these people, look, just have a shower, go to talk to some people like a normal person. And yes, they should definitely do that. But also, like, there's a weird way they kind of, like it's a collective self-harm in which there's, for example, one thing that really struck out to me was this idea of having very thin wrists, which is not something I've ever thought about as impugning on my masculinity or anything. Like, my wrists are, I don't know, wrists are wrists, aren't they? And so, but there's this long post of some guy talking about how feminine his wrists are and how he can't go out in public without gloves, etc., etc. And it's these kind of ridiculous ways of hurting each other and hurting yourself that I think speaks to this movement. There's a kind of walling yourself off from society, only talking to other people who are also walled off from society.
Something else we touched on briefly just before, but I wanted to get into a bit more now. There's a famous and possibly apocryphal Lenin quote, which is that fascism is capitalism in decay. How does that relationship between fascism and capitalism play out in the age of the internet?
That's a really interesting question. How does it? It's a good one-liner, for sure. Good job, Lenin. Like all one-liners, I don't know how to respond to it, though. So what is capitalist decay? Any thoughts?
I mean, we have the benefit of hindsight. Like, capitalism continued after fascism, so like obviously capitalism has a way of rejuvenating and regenerating itself, and you know, we saw that with the kind of golden period after the Second World War, and then neoliberalism and whatever happens afterwards. I think there is some truth in that. There is an interdependent relationship here. I think Lenin is right in the regard that there is a relationship, and I don't really see fascism as like a particularly as like the final horrific endpoint of capitalism itself, because I think it kind of denies the kind of movement between kind of the use of reactionary movements and fascist movements to capital and to capitalist organizing of life. And so we can see this, I suppose, with, for example, the recent push by the UK government to ramp up borders and institute pushbacks in the channel and this kind of really horrific stuff. And that's awful in itself and should be organised against. But we see on the edge of that, we see people like the Little Veteran and Active Patriot, these people who are going and filming very vulnerable people crossing the channel and kind of documenting them and harassing them when they're arriving on beaches and on the south coast. And we see the kind of way in which these like movements to the further right of the Tories push them to the right, and they also use those far-right movements in order to further their agenda too. That didn't really answer Lenin, but I don't care about, you know, Lenin's Lenin, isn't he?
That's fair enough. The notion of the Tories being pushed far to the right is an interesting one. I mean, I think it's quite obvious that's happened at various times. But is that an example of how these different streams of the far right can bleed together in terms of conservatism being pushed into reactionary thinking and beyond?
So in this sense, like, anti-fascism has set itself quite a weird task, right? Because anti-fascism very often essentially concerns itself with politics to the very far right of the conservatives. Like, anti-fascism in the last, say, 10, 15 years, like, an anti-fascist action would be to point out that Jacob Rees-Mogg has gone to like dinners with members of the traditional Britain group, right, who are really, really far right. Like, and making this connection would be a kind of a way in which an anti-fascist action would take place here. But trying to get Jacob Rees-Mogg not elected in the first place wouldn't be anti-fascism. Right, not that I'm trying to make that kind of just hard and fast distinction, but I'm just pointing out that this is how anti-fascism is kind of conceived of it. That is the beginning of anti-fascism space, is this kind of making associations. And then at the other end, it extends to groups like, for example, National Action. Don't know if anyone remembers National Action. They were kind of a flash in the pan moment, and they kind of disappeared. But they were an extreme, expressly neo-Nazi organization in the UK, whose members were arrested. Most famously, Jack Renshaw was arrested for plotting to kill both the police officer who was investigating him for grooming a child, and also his MP. Right, the plan was to kill both of them in the same kind of moment. So the space of anti-fascism is somewhere between these two things. Right, it's between conservative MPs and terrorism. And this way, we have like conventional politics, and opposing the Conservative Party, and standing in elections and so on. And that side, you have the counter-terrorism police. And so it's quite an odd space in which to like concern yourself with things, because it is so like diverse, it's so various as a kind of political space. But it's actually a very, very small part of the political spectrum. Lots of things go on there, but it's quite like a constrained area. I've forgotten the question.
I guess it was, is this the influence of the far right on the
Yes.
Tory party? Yes.
So the problem that anti-fascism therefore faces is because it's defined this area kind of in terms of the Conservative Party, it often becomes quite mute, like doesn't talk very much about these transformations within the right end of the Conservative Party as it kind of bleeds out, the far right kind of bleeds into it. But it's also in this particular zone that things become most unclear in trying to define fascism and trying to define fascism in relation to capitalism. So what is fascism? As like a kind of a way of maintaining capitalism, is it just aiming at the same kind of things as capitalism, as benefits capitalism in certain areas? So capitalism has a kind of uneven geography. It's not that it's disastrous everywhere, but being like a middle-class Swede, right, is very different, obviously, from being killed in the Mediterranean, right, trying to enter Europe. But in some way, the two things are very highly related. And so the question is, like, how does fascism relate to capitalism? And like, it becomes most unclear, I think, in this particular zone around the right end of the Conservative Party as the far right, and its kind of quasi-radicalism bleeds into the deep, deep conventionalism of politics as it currently exists. That's also not an answer to the question, sorry.
There's another problem here with this kind of bleeding is that thinking in terms of like kind of the activity of the left, there's often times we have anti-racist movements and anti-fascist movements, and they're often unhelpfully set against each other, or set in opposition, or prioritize one over the other. And in many ways, that's fine. Like, anti-racism is a much more prescient, much more important kind of politics to pursue in this present moment. That's just how it's just true. But oftentimes we'll have people say that they're separate politics and should be pursued separately. And I think that kind of gets away from the idea of thinking about anti-fascism as part of a wider anti-racist struggle, which I think is really, really important. And the way I like to describe it is think about the consequences of having a strong fascist movement in this country, like Mosley, or even like, for example, something like the BNP or the NF. What happens to like state racism? What happens to the racism of the police? What happens to the borders? They all get worse. If there's a big, strong fascist movement in this country, they get much worse. And so we want to be minimizing these fascist movements, the far-right movements, as much as possible, not just because we need to impose them as anti-fascist, but also in kind of as part of a wider anti-racist struggle in society.
Okay, thank you. There's something that the far right seems to have become particularly good at, or at least is a hallmark of it, and maybe it's more so in the US than here, is its relationship or how it uses symbology. There's quite a few instances of the far right kind of emptying out recognizable signs and refilling them with new meaning, things like the OK gesture or Fred Perry branded shirts, this kind of thing. Is that a far right thing, or is it an online culture thing in general, do you think?
So I think it in some ways expresses the weakness of the movement and also expresses its like new forms of power. So I'll give you a more extreme example than those things. So what the OK sign does, this is the OK sign, right? But what if actually it wasn't the OK sign? It was a W and a P for white power, right? Pretty clever. Right, so this is the kind of thing that like you might, the far right would do, right? The idea is that you would appropriate a sign and make it seem threatening. But the point is that the sign, the reason why it demonstrates weakness is because it means they don't have the capacity to enforce signs upon society in a way that, by generating their own signs. All they can do is like kind of pick up or salvage things from the kind of the structure of communicative structure in society in general, right? They can only just like pick things up and try and change them.
That even goes back to their use of runic alphabets, presumably as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is in some ways like a massive LARP.
Yeah.
That's the weakness. But the strength of it is in generating a kind of excessive response, particularly from some, for example, like liberal antifascism, that says that the strength of the movement is somehow contained in the signs, which is a massive mistake. Of course, the strength of the movement is not contained in the signs. But a large part of the tactics or power of fascism in its classical mode, interwar, the Nazis and the Italian fascists particularly, was to make politics seem as if it was about the power of signs, right? The power of the sign of Germany, the sign of Italy, the sign of the Volk, the sign of Lola, the sign of the swastika, right? Which presents something to you that is infinitely deep and which you can't get to the bottom of because it's displaced, right? The sign indicates the Germany, and Hitler indicates Germany, but like Hitler's just a man, but he's like the avatar for Germany, right? So you get this kind of endless regression where you can never find the depth that is hinted at, and so there's kind of a process of deferral. Oh no, the sign is over there, the sign is over there, the meaning is over there. And that's a very difficult thing to contend with politically because it stimulates a kind of excessive response in trying to clamp down on what can and cannot be said, which is not really what's at stake. The question is not like, what can and what cannot be said. The question is how is society structured and who is not subject to violence, right? That's what the question of politics is. And so yeah, I think the power of it is really in stimulating this. It's a diversion, but it's a very successful diversion.
Oftentimes with these things like the kind of the guy who does this the most, like is Richard Spencer, who was the kind of at some point dubbed the leader of the alt-right, and he would often put different emojis in his Twitter handle or name or whatever, or he would like explain Pepe the Frog and then get punched in the face and things like this. And oftentimes he kind of wants people to get mad about it and tell everyone that it's actually fascism. Like a glass of milk is now fascism, the OK sign is now fascism. And in many ways, it only really has meaning to the people who know what it is. So like, it'll mean something to his followers, and it'll mean something to freaks like us who read all that stuff. And and it doesn't really go much beyond that, unless it kind of has a breakout moment like Pepe the Frog or whatever. And it's really interesting now, seeing how the far right have kind of lost a bit of that kind of frisson with signs and lost the energy for it and lost the kind of instinct for it, in that they're still trying to produce these emojis and signs and try and make new things fascist, and people are just not noticing anymore because they don't have the same power that they did maybe even a few years ago. So, you know, I think largely it was a sign of weakness all along, but we didn't really realise it until after it had ended, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, does that suggest that the power and influence of the far right as an online presence is quite difficult to actually determine because of these, obviously that when they are reported on in the media, there is always a kind of element of spectacle to it, but at the same time, for example, as you say, the iconography they use actually doesn't have much meaning beyond their particular networks.
Well, this is how we get to thinking about the difference between online space and physical space.
Yeah.
On online space, you can make yourself many, many times. You can create many different Twitter accounts. You can have different browsers open, all with a different Twitter account, all be tweeting things. You can have bots. You can have all these different things. And you can make yourself seem much bigger than you actually are. And you can make yourself seem much more capable and with much more agency than you actually have. And it's only since we've seen a kind of a clampdown on social media on extremist content more generally, which I think in general is a bad thing because it shuts out things we want to be expressed to,
I'm ambivalent about.
Okay, he's ambivalent. Is that well, got off the thing.
Sorry, shouldn't have.
I shouldn't have looked at you. What was I saying? All right.
It's not my responsibility. I don't know.
Oh yeah, okay. And so what we see with something like Charlottesville is that we see the movement as it is, how they can get people out on the street, how many people can they manifest, what do they do when they're there, and do they sustain themselves on the street? And what we saw is that they got quite handily defeated at Charlottesville. They didn't succeed. It wasn't a success in the long run. And since Charlottesville, we've seen various attempts to reform themselves. We've seen Unite the Right 2, it'd be a complete failure, things like this. And it's not until we've seen the kind of, I suppose, the anti-vax and anti-lockdown movements in which the far right have felt a little more able to kind of be present in physical space.
That's another really good example, actually, of the kind of the appearance of far-right motive behind something that is actually much more diverse. Right, so it's not just the OK sign, which people make all the time, but the kind of actually like anti-lockdown politics in general. Like, anti-lockdown politics is not exclusively a far-right domain. There are lots of people who don't want to take vaccines. They're not all on the far right. There are lots of people who don't want to have the state tell them that they can't leave the house. Not all of those people on the far right. I'm not suggesting that I am one of those people. I don't support that politics, but like the capacity of the far right to appear as a kind of a boogeyman behind all kinds of political phenomena that are actually not powered by them, that are not controlled by them, that are not even motivated by their ideas, is one of the most kind of impressive aspects of their power. They seem to be everywhere, and yet, like, there actually aren't that many of them. They're actually not particularly powerful.
Yeah. Do you think in the wake of incidents like Charlottesville and the kind of January 6th assault on the Capitol, but also various kind of spree killings like the Christchurch massacre and things like that, that there is a tendency, particularly in the media, but maybe the wider public consciousness, to look at these things as part of just a block of a result of a way of thinking which is just the far right as a kind of monolithic thing, and not as a result of particularly virulent strains of it. Do you think that obscures something important?
Alex mentioned this earlier, right? Like there's lots of kind of infighting. I mean, you know about bickering on the left, right? I'm assuming you've seen bickering on the left. It's much worse on the far right, like so much worse. Like, you can imagine such a thing. Like really, really intense kind of like fractures between these groups. And also they want very different things. And so it's important to be able to distinguish between the different groups. I think it's important to be able to differentiate them in order that you, not just that you can oppose them individually, so like, okay, this has this problem, we deal with this like that, that is that, we'll deal with that like that, but because they can be turned against each other very handily. It's not that difficult to stimulate a kind of intra-far right like conflict. It's not that hard. I'm not going to give you an example of it, but you know, it's happened, and it's pretty effective.
I'm going to go to audience questions in a minute, so please, if you've got one, a burning question, then get ready to stick your hand up. But the last one I want to ask just for now is, as I said earlier, you've got a book coming out next year on the rise of ecofascism, and you do touch on ecofascism as a strain of the far right in this book. Could you say a bit about the rise of ecofascism and the nature of it as a contemporary phenomenon?
So while we were writing the book, and actually maybe for you before, but for me, I only really got really scared about the climate crisis in the last few years. I always knew it was a problem, but I'm now absolutely terrified, like all the time. And what we wanted to do with this second book, and we talk about a little bit in the last chapter of the book, is we think about the far right in fascism as responding or feeding off various crises. And we saw this, for example, in the interwar period of feeding off kind of a sustained economic crisis, a sustained kind of crisis of the post-war, the kind of mental and physical harms that the First World War did. And we can see throughout kind of the 20th and 21st century, different far-right groups exploiting or creating themselves or like describing various crises with which they have a radical or like, you know, very kind of sweeping solution to. A good example, a recent example, is the migrant crisis, which is a term that, you know, is beloved of most of the media, basically all of the media. And of which the far right has responded with various kind of, invasions of hotels in which asylum seekers are staying in, for example, which Britain First have done quite a lot, or, like I said before, the kind of monitoring of the south coast of England and filming people who are coming off on boats, sort of thing. And that naturally led us to think, well, the climate crisis is the biggest, most awful crisis of our lives. It's already happening, and it's going to get worse and worse and worse for the rest of our lives. And no matter what we do about it, if we stopped all carbon emissions tomorrow, it would still be super bad, and there'd be massive kind of disasters that happen in the world. It's going to happen. And so we thought, how would the far right then respond to this overarching crisis? People often think of this idea of eco-fascism as like a kind of a coherent movement already existing and pushing forward. And that could happen in the future. It's not really happening now. We're only really starting to see the far right incorporate environmentalism, broadly defined, into their politics and using it often to further other agendas, white supremacy, anti-migrant stuff, like I said before. But also, just the other thing we should be really concerned about is how will the neoliberal state respond to the climate crisis? And we've already seen that also. If you see what's happening on the edges of the EU, you see the kind of militarization of borders, even the current kind of crisis of migrants at the Belarusian border coming into Poland. And you see how not just the kind of far-right bits of the EU are responding to it, but also like, Germany or the EU Commission are all kind of not just turning this into a crisis, but kind of like framing these people as dangerous weapons who are coming into Europe. And we can already see this happening, and it's not hard to think about how these things will become more and more intensified, especially in kind of an era post kind of vaccine era in which most of the world is still not vaccinated.
Yeah. Do you think that in some ways the pandemic itself has been a gift to the far right in terms of both the atmosphere of uncertainty and kind of general worry, but also as you pointed out earlier, that not everyone who's against vaccinations is far right, but the kind of gateway of that to conspiratorial thinking. Do you think that has in some ways benefited the far right?
It depends which part. So it depends which part of the far right thinking about. I think it's fairly clear it didn't benefit Trump, right? He lost the election. It's possible he would not have lost the election without the pandemic. Did it benefit the European far right, like the kind of the major parties, the Front National, or the Rassemblement National, which is the renamed Front National in France? It's unclear. I think, it kind of complicated situation. Probably much more significant there is like the rise of Eric Zemmour, right? Who's a kind of this, kind of a far right influencer type, kind of who's been a pundit on French TV for a very long time and is now and is very far right. Probably kind of stylizes himself more often than not as kind of to the right of Le Pen, as the kind of the really radical candidate who Le Pen has kind of gone soft and blah blah. Did it benefit them? Not clear. Probably not. Did it benefit the movements? Did it benefit the online far right movements? Not really, I wouldn't say. It became, in some sense, quite monotonous. There was a lot of misanthropy on far right messaging boards in the very early pandemic. They were like, aha, finally, a thing that is going to disrupt the entire world. For a long time, neoliberalism has seemed unassailable, but now suddenly this is our chance. There's going to be a pandemic and so on. That got old very quickly, and it was also replaced by another tendency on the far right in that kind of online space, which is towards conspiracism, right? So there were lots of people who were, in the early pandemic on the far right, simultaneously affirming that this pandemic was going to be the end of what they think of as the kind of the Jewish world order, right? And at the same time was in fact produced by like an Israeli company. So at the same time, a belief that this is the end and a belief that this is simply more of the same. And it's being stuck in this bind, the fact they can never recognize a new crisis, right? Every crisis just seems like the last one. Every crisis just seems like the same thing over and over and over again. The fact that the far right politics doesn't have a very clear sense of how the world actually works means that they're probably not going to be able to operationalize the climate crisis in anything like the kind of flexible way that they might otherwise seem to be able to. But in the short to moderate term, all of their conventional weapons, like clamping down on borders, arguing, making racist arguments and so on, committing terrorist attacks, all of those short-term tactics are going to get more and more and more viable. But it's going to take a very long time before we see like a genuine kind of ecological far right. Because, as I've mentioned lots of times, their interests are fundamentally aligned with the interests of capital, right? And capitalism is going to struggle a great deal to have an ecological politics, and that's why the far right are too.
We need to be able to be careful that we don't get too, I said I was really terrified about the climate crisis, and I am, but we need to be careful not to get too hung up on it and obscure ourselves from seeing what other things are animating the far right too. And I would say, particularly in Europe, and there is a kind of rise in these kind of far-right governments and parties. There's a rise of a fight against what they call gender ideology, which I think is, you know, one of the most animating things for these parties. And so that's an attack on LGBT people, it's an attack on abortion rights, it's an attack on women more generally, it's an attack on trans people specifically within LGBTQ, within that spectrum. And we need to be really scared about that too, I think.
Any questions from the audience? Yes, we do have a mic? Oh, we do have a mic that's coming. Just a moment. Oh, just over there. So you, yeah.
So I was just wondering if you guys are familiar with like Landian style accelerationism.
Yes.
Yeah, and whether you think that provides like maybe an answer or to like how capitalism and fascism connects, and if you think it makes it seem more powerful than maybe you've alluded to as in outright, or if you think it's just an empirically false sort of theory and therefore doesn't.
Yeah.
And Nick Land is his thing, so he will
Wow.
Yeah, we have a very strict division of labour. Alex is...
Sorry?
Could you repeat the question? So
Oh, yeah, sure. So it's about Landian accelerationism, which, I mean, you might be better at defining this than me, but relates to the theorist Nick Land. You know, how that maybe recasts the relationship between fascism and capitalism. Is that a fair paraphrasing? Yeah.
Okay, so what is Landian accelerationism? I'm going to try and give you a very brief...
like 2 minutes, sir.
2 minutes, okay. So the world's getting faster. That's the basic idea. The world's getting faster, and it's getting faster because capitalism is accelerating it. And one of the problems that accelerationism brings is the idea that because the world's getting faster, people in the world are less and less able to respond in a coherent, adequate way, right? You're driving a car and it's much faster. Like it's more difficult to like steer it. And modernity is just accelerating, and we are getting worse and worse at steering it. So it's just kind of doing whatever it wants to do. And because of this, because in some sense, like, therefore capitalism kind of has a mind of its own that can't be controlled by anyone within inside it, because no one is able to respond coherently. Because capitalism simply does what it wants, the accelerationist response is to let go of political ideals, to let go of the idea that you could coherently try and steer this thing. Just kind of let go of the steering wheel, it'll just do what it wants, right? There are different variants of accelerationism. There's left accelerationism, which is a very different thing. So if you've read like Nick Cernacek's or Alex Williams' book, that's not what I'm talking about, like it's something else. This is also not like fully automated luxury communism. That's also a different thing. So left accelerationism is very different. There's a thing called unconditional accelerationism, which is like really let go, like really completely let go. And there's right accelerationism, which is saying essentially that the culmination of this process of capital becoming ever more powerful is that everything becomes a market. And so ultimately what you need in order to do this rationally or efficiently, is to have a market for governments. Not elections, but a market for governance. Lots of city-states dotted around the world, and you can just choose which one you go to. This is known as patchwork. It's an idea by a guy called Curtis Yarvin, who's an American computer programmer. So the idea is that you would have authoritarianism in service of capitalism, right? Because each of these governments is maximally authoritarian in its little city-state, and this produces the best possible market for governance. If you're lost, don't worry. It is kind of nonsense, right? So that's like one reason why you might be lost. This is, as you can guess from the complexity of how I'm trying to explain it, this is a very small part of the far right, and it's a very esoteric part of the far right that was very popular in 2018. It's since disappeared a bit because Nick Land stopped kind of like engaging with it. And he was the most kind of important thinker of it. I don't think that it shares enough with classical fascism, which is really about the movement of a racialized people to warrant being called fascism. I do think that the marketization of the state as a mode of making the state more and more and more and more and more authoritarian is a totally viable thing that is probably going to happen. So that's the answer. But I don't think it necessitates the term fascism. I think it's really quite a different thing.
Thanks. I've always thought of Nick Land as kind of like the Darth Vader to Mark Fisher's Obi-Wan Kenobi.
I haven't seen Star Trek, so...
I see what you did there. Any more? Sorry. Any more questions from the audience? One right at the back there, and then we'll.
Is there any way that you could come out here? Is that okay? It just doesn't stretch far enough.
So with a figure like Trump, who, as much as he kind of like fed into the fact that the far right and fascists liked him so much, never really did anything for their political projects and just like continued the status quo in essence. How can you get groups like Q that are still so extremely loyal to him, even though he has no power and really didn't do anything for them other than kind of visibility?
QAnon?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the question is about Trump, and despite his extreme conventionality, how come QAnon, the Q movement, was really into him for a very long time?
I think, do you want to go for it?
I mean, part of it is because QAnon is just a wild conspiracy theory that is very fictionalized anyway, and it relies on the kind of classic the way that conspiracies are made, which is kind of like an improvisational form of knowledge. So like people will be like, yes, and this also is part of Q universe, or yes, and he's also doing this, and yes, and there's Satan involved somewhere, or something like that. And so the kind of idea of Trump is very disconnected from what he was actually doing, which is, you're completely right, completely conventional. You know, like very in line with a lot of what the kind of American state does all the time anyway. And so we see, when you track Q through its kind of many different various forms and stages and various branching paths, you'll see a reading of Trump that doesn't like bear up to reality. You'll see Trump like make some weird offhand comment about a storm coming at some kind of very generic photo op for military officials. And then you'll see the storm, you know, as a thing that's going to come and sweep up America, or whatever, be a central part of Q's kind of universe. And so we see this constant like reading into Trump's actions that doesn't really bear fruit. And that's, I think, part of conspiracy making itself. Like, it's part of how creative it can often be.
I think also it's about the kind of the story I was telling, slightly kind of without nuance earlier, about the densely knit societies, kind of in the post-war period, or actually back through to the 19th century, being shattered or torn apart by neoliberalism, atomized, everyone split up, and then suddenly the internet like being this kind of new way of connecting that connects people in very powerful but quite shallow ways. So it's the generation of people who are convinced by Q, they're mostly older, mostly in their 50s, 60s, 70s and so on, lived through that time where they had basically no stake in power, and so the state and government and even politics in general seemed like this thing just over there, right? It's like completely impenetrable, just like there are the elites, they do what they want, and like, you know, we suffer the consequences. And then these people get online, right? They start to like join Facebook, right? And I don't want to give a kind of technological determinist argument, but they join Facebook and they start joining Twitter and so on around the kind of beginnings of the 2010s. And so in some sense they experience this kind of sudden connection they have with other people as like something completely novel. They've never been involved in politics before. They've never been engaged by the world. They never felt that they had some sort of stake in it. And suddenly now they have what they think is like a capacity to transform the world in like this really kind of extraordinary way. I can just say something and 200,000 people see it, right? That's like quite like a superpower if you have been atomized for your entire life. And so QAnon is simply, does everyone know what QAnon is? Yeah, okay. So QAnon is simply the thing that gets into like the kind of the deep like logic of how social structures have been taken apart and now how they're being put back together. It's just like the most effective thing at running along those grooves. And Trump is really disappointing for those people, right? He didn't do anything, he's very boring, so it must be a secret plot, it must be this ploy. But I think it's really about this, this like history of disconnecting people and then reconnecting them in a way they experience as like unbelievably exciting, novel, and so on. And so it just zooms off in all different directions. It's like the invention of the printing press, right? Like, it's like, oh my God, you can now read, then you suddenly get into conspiracies, right? I don't know if that happens.
No, that does sound technologically determined.
Yeah.
Time for a couple more audience questions. Still, we come here on the right, Jess, please, and then we'll go to the back there.
So you're talking about the way that the far right sort of appears like a boogeyman behind things, and in some ways that's similar to sort of the conspiracism that sort of seeps into the far right in the way that it acts generally. I'm wondering if you think there's a way that the left can weaponize conspiracism both as a tool for neutering the right and perhaps for developing our own ideas. Is there anything you can say on that?
Do you want to? I didn't hear
Could you repeat the question? Sorry, if you heard it.
Was it utilizing conspiracism or those ways of thinking on the left, essentially? Yeah.
Okay. So I would encourage I don't think as on the left we can do that at scale. Right? We can't commit ourselves to like a thing we know isn't true. Right? I think that would be tactically and strategically disastrous because reality bats last. Right? If you're just like wrong about the world, eventually you will find out because everything you try and do will fail. But I definitely think there's a huge utility when faced with very particular things in rumor, disinformation, as I was saying before, like getting parts of the far right to kind of bicker with each other and like using half-truths, lies of omission, as well as lies of commission, right, to spread fear, mistrust, and so on the far right. Fine by me. But I don't have any particular things in mind.
There was one last question at the back on the left-hand side, I think. Somebody has? Yeah? Oh, yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for the talk, and also thank you for the book, which I'm 2/3 of the way through, and it's incredibly engaging and insightful. Plug. I had a question about what you were saying about the relation between the kind of neoliberal state and the far right, and I kind of wanted to chuck out an analogy or a way of thinking about it and see what you thought about that.
So you were mentioning the ways in which, for example, if you look at border policing, at the moment there's a great deal of collusion and kind of continuity between what the state does and what the far right does and or wants. And you're also talking about the kind of blend in with the right of the Conservative Party. But I was also thinking it's kind of not even confined to the Conservative Party that the aims of the state and the kind of aims of state policing are aligned with the far right. So all of the kind of the sort of primary targets of policing institutions and the primary targets of the far right are map onto each other. Here's the analogy. The analogy is that of a snowplow, where if you think about all of the people and the groups and the communities that are the kind of would have reason and opportunity to resist the far right, those are precisely the groups that the state spends all of their time and also the media demonizing, harassing, attacking, disappearing, incarcerating. And so there you have the kind of neoliberal state operating as this kind of ground clearing device that then, you know, you have the far right marching down that cleared highway. And then I suppose the final neat trick from the perspective of the state is that they then legitimize their own policing operations with reference to the threat of the far right. So, you know, counter-terrorist policing, that's actually great now because we need it to counter the far right and so on. And I just wondered what you made of that analysis and that analogy.
I think it's a really good one, and I will probably steal it if I remember it. I think that I just want to pick up on, maybe you could do the first bit. I just want to talk about the counter-terror thing. Like, this is a thing that's happening more and more in that ever since National Action got prescribed, which is like banned as a coherent political entity, and subsequently any successor organisation was banned too, we've seen like a kind of push from the police and from a certain section of the liberal anti-fascist complex that with, more and more going towards we should prescribe basically everything. There's loads and loads of problems with this, mainly because it doesn't actually really stop people being fascist, or it doesn't stop fascists operating. It just bans a group and sends them away for a prison for a long time. Now, if I was banned by the state and I was sent to prison for a long time, maybe I would stop doing my politics. But also, I wouldn't not stop doing my politics. You know, I might get more and more extreme. I might see all legitimate options for my awful politics come about, and then just decide to shoot somebody, or blow something up, or stab somebody, or whatever. Like, if the far right sees that like legitimate ways of getting what they want done, even if it is awful, if they see those ways shut down, they will turn to violence. And we want to avoid violence from the far right as much as possible because people get really hurt and stuff. The way that the prescription thing is working now is that like kind of amorphous, unclear whether they're even real or not, whether they're a coherent group or not, groups such as the Order of the Nine Angles. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of these people. They're this kind of boogeyman, kind of Satanist, animal sacrificing Nazis who kind of celebrate famous serial killers and things like this. Very, the image is awful. And we see like quite mainstream organizations like Hope Not Hate campaign to have these groups prescribed. Now, prescription of national action is one thing. These were membership, which is a membership organization with, you were definitely in it if you were in it. And they could tell whether you were in it or not because, you were on their actions and all this stuff. The Order of Nine Angles, we have no idea anything about them. Like, people read these kind of esoteric texts from the 70s, but the fact that they have read it or maybe referenced something kind of makes them a member, maybe. And when we get into this kind of situation, it means that, basically anyone could be prescribed for subscribing to an idea without actually being a member of a group, which is quite dangerous, I think. And so we need to resist counter-terror encroachment into kind of anti-fascism. We need to resist this at all costs, as alongside resisting it in the ways the left traditionally would, which is like policing of Muslim communities and all that other stuff.
So in the very last bit of the book, the postscript, we talk about, because we wrote the book mostly in 2020, so the January 6th thing, which you alluded to earlier, hadn't yet happened, and we wrote that kind of postscript like immediately in the aftermath of that, particularly concerned not just with the kind of the forms of violence that the far right propagates, but in some ways like complacency, complicity, and so on, particularly of like establishment Democrats in the US with the FBI in their investigations into the people who are in that event. I think that is a mistake. I think the FBI is the enemy. I mean, not in the UK. I don't want to kind of like make it seem like
the CIA.
Yeah, here is the CIA.
Yeah.
No, it's actually the KGB. No, that's stupid. So I think yes, absolutely. Your question kind of touches on like one of the sorest and like least certain parts of the whole book and analysis, which is this relationship I've been trying to kind of get at but not really quite explain, between the reproduction of society through everyday quotidian forms of violence and the reproduction of society through exceptional violence, right? Organized political violence on the far right. It's very, very difficult to work out how to like separate these two things. It's very difficult to work out how to not do two things. One is to say it's all the same, which is not. It's not all the same. There are, as we've like tried to insist, like big distinctions between the police and far-right terrorists, perhaps not in the people who are killed, but in the manner in which they are killed, in the recourse to justice that there is, and so on. These are very different. I'm not saying one's better or worse. Like obviously that's not my point. Like but they are very different things. So we mustn't say they are the same. But we also, absolutely, as your kind of question alludes to, mustn't simply say they're totally different orders of things. State violence is legitimate, non-state violence is like illegitimate, and so on. And so there's a real bind between these two positions, right? And I think this is one of the biggest problems that anti-fascism faces, is the question of how to deal with the relationship between quotidian violence, everyday violence, the state violence, and exceptional far-right violence. But I don't have an answer to how it deals with that bind. I just think the bind is there. But the answer can't be to empower the state, obviously, as I'm sure you'd agree.
And just on the Capitol riot thing, what we saw in the wake of that is like, presumably following a logic of like, everything is on the table when you're fighting fascists, everything is available as an option. You saw a certain section of American anti-fascists get really into finding out who these people were who took part in the riot and then dobbing them into the FBI. And this is like, it seems like a kind of fine thing to do. Obviously, it's not. It's not a fine thing to do, like, and yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those great questions to the audience. Thank you, Jess, for running around with the roving mic.
Thanks to you.
No,
Thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you too.
What a positive atmosphere we've created. Yeah, this has been fascinating. It's particularly interesting in light of the necessity of these kind of analyses in forging a more effective anti-fascist resistance, I think, at all levels. So just to say once again, Sam and Alex, the book they've written is Post-Internet Far Right from Dog Section Press, which is for sale over there. Also, please check out their podcast, 12 Rules for What. It's very good, available through all good podcast subscription services. But for now, please join me in thanking our two wonderful authors.